Welcome to the Low-carb USA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Hey, Doug.
Hey, Ben. It's really good to have you on. It's been a long time coming, man. I've been trying to connect with you for the longest time. The last time we were talking about trying to do something with collecting all that data at our event in San Diego last year.
Right.
With Dave Feldman. And then for some reason you weren't able to actually be there that weekend. But it was probably a good thing because the whole idea was we were going to do that blood draw at the beginning and then blood draw at the end.
Yeah.
But turned out to logistically to be a hell of a lot more challenging than we thought it would be. And so I think in the end, we only managed one blood draw each throughout some time through the weekend. So it didn't, it didn't work out the way we planned, but we learned a lot from that, and hopefully we'll have a much better version of it next time we can actually all be live. It's so good to have you on, and it kind of, the guy reached out to me about having you on almost at the exact perfect time, because I got a message saying that Paul Saladino had done a YouTube video about PUFAs and insulin resistance, and he talks there a lot about this, and he puts it in inverted commas, this friendly chat with debate with Ben Bikman. And that led me down the rabbit hole because it's a 2.5 hour discussion, and it was actually really good. But in that preceding introductory YouTube video that he did or something, he made a statement there that he didn't make when he was talking with you. At least I didn't hear him say it. And that was like, he literally said, we need to be insulin resistant. That's the whole point of a ketogenic diet. Those were his words. And I feel like he's just trying to redefine what insulin resistance means, and it's just got everybody confused. And so I was kind of hoping that you could clear that up, at least with regards to the definition, what he was trying to say, and maybe get some clarity out of all of this.
Yeah, so I suspect you're right. I suspect that people are using insulin resistance liberally, and so this might be more of a problem, really, of just establishing a common vernacular. What I suspect Paul was invoking when he was mentioning insulin resistance was this idea that glucose use is down in someone who has adapted to a low-carb diet. But that in no way reflects insulin resistance. In fact, I disagree with that sentiment completely, because the fact is, Doug, if I took a group of people that were low-carb adapted and I injected them with 50 units of insulin, it would kill them probably from hypoglycemia because they're so sensitive to the insulin. So they are not insulin resistant. They have perhaps become somewhat glucose intolerant, and that is not the same thing. But in this case, that would be reflected as a person who eats a big load of carbohydrates after having adapted to a low-carb diet, and now they find that their glucose levels go higher than they were before. Perhaps they're higher for longer. And again, that is a glucose intolerance, which is not synonymous with insulin resistance, because again, certainly this can be done in lab animals. If you have animals that have adapted to a ketogenic diet and you give them what's called an insulin tolerance test, they are exquisitely insulin sensitive. They will have a much greater hypoglycemic effect to that insulin load than the standard chow-fed animals. So I do not agree that a ketogenic or low-carb diet will cause insulin resistance. That is not the point. The point of a low-carb diet, in my mind, although it would differ perhaps based on the person, the power of a low-carb diet is that it lowers insulin and improves insulin sensitivity. We know that happens. We know there are clinical studies to confirm that insulin sensitivity is improved in humans that adapt to a low-carb diet. So that's the point of a low-carb diet, to become insulin sensitive. Now, there are instances, at least in my mind, to some people, the point of a low-carb diet would be because they need to stay in ketosis, perhaps for the sake of their migraine headaches or their epilepsy. So it's the ketone that's the purpose. But for the overwhelming majority of people who have some metabolic related illness, which most are, the point is to become insulin sensitive. That may come with acute glucose intolerance, where the body has and I think that's an important point, where so much of illness is this metabolic, so much of metabolic related illness is a metabolic inflexibility. And undoubtedly your audience is familiar with that term, but very briefly, human metabolism is a hybrid that is predominantly relying on two fuels. Now there are others here, more than just the typical ones we think of, in fact, but it's mostly glucose and fat. That is the bulk. Those are the majority, the major two fuels. And a healthy person, when they eat, they go to glucose burning. When they're fasting, a few hours after eating, they shift to predominantly be relying on fat burning. Insulin is what dictates the shift between these fuels. Unfortunately, most people are constantly living in hyperinsulinemia, that they're stuck in sugar burning. Even when they start to fast, they're still in sugar burning. That is metabolic inflexibility that typifies type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance and most of the people around us. In contrast, I think it's fair to say that when someone adapts to a low-carb ketogenic diet, they sort of develop an inverse metabolic flexibility, inflexibility, where they are kind of stuck in fat burning mode. I don't believe that's pathological, but it does mean, just like the sugar burner who's metabolically inflexible has a hard time burning fat, now, at least for a brief period of time, the fat burner may have a hard time burning sugar. If we load the system with a lot of glucose, the ketogenic adherent indulges with a bunch of bagels, it will take a little time to more than normal, more than it would have, to clear that glucose. But give them a day or two of eating the bagels and they'll be right back to normal. They'll be able to burn that sugar just fine. So it's a temporary, and I do not believe it's pathological, metabolic inflexibility in the other direction. But that is not insulin resistance. So I do not agree with people invoking that term. Now, insulin resistance isn't always pathological, to be clear. There is insulin resistance, also what's called physiological insulin resistance, and that occurs in pregnancy and puberty. But what is so important, Doug, is that in the body, any time of insulin resistance, it cannot be considered, at least by my definition, we cannot define something as insulin resistance unless insulin is elevated. So altered insulin signaling at some cells, that's the insulin resistant part of it. But in the whole body, there's this other component, which is hyperinsulinemia. If you do not have hyperinsulinemia, you do not have insulin resistance. And so in the pathological states of insulin resistance, like the overweight hypertensive patient, that's obviously hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance. However, in the physiological states of insulin resistance, like puberty and pregnancy, they also have elevated insulin. It is hyperinsulinemic, and it serves a purpose because it's fueling growth. In a low-carb diet, insulin becomes exquisitely low. We have no problem with hyperinsulinemia, and it's because we don't have insulin resistance. We might have an acute state of glucose intolerance, but those aren't the same thing.
Yeah. I've heard you talking about insulin resistance. I mean, it's like insulin affects almost every cell in our body to some extent. And you talk about where different cells can have different levels of insulin resistance. So the muscle cells or the liver or whatever may show huge signs of insulin resistance, and yet there may be other cells that don't. One of the things I feel like Paul was trying to get at was he was just focusing on the fat cells. and saying
Oh,
whether those fat cells were insulin resistant or not. And how do you define that? I mean, the way I understand it, we've got, that it activates LPL to help push fat into the fat cells, and it downregulates HSL so that to prevent mobilizing the fat out of the fat cells. And maybe he's saying, okay, so you want to be able to enable fat to come out of the cell. So if you insulin resistant, then it means it's not activating the HSL in the inside the fat cell, which is allowing mobilization of the fat out of the fat cell. And so that means that you're insulin resistant, because you're resistant to what insulin does in the fat cell. And that, to me, it's like,
yeah, right. You're right. I'm remembering part of the conversation I had with him. Yeah, where he did focus on the fat cell, and then he was mentioning some of these ideas by a blog called Hyperlipid, which has become a popular sentiment that saturated fats cause insulin resistance in the fat cell, uniquely because of what's happening at the electron transport complexes. And I think that the biochemistry is interesting in looking at that perspective, but I do not know that we see that in practice, because my thought is that if insulin resistance starts to happen at the fat cells of people who are adapting to a low-carb diet, we would expect to see their free fatty acids climbing a lot. And I don't know that happens. I don't know that what I ought to have done is looked at some of these clinical studies that have measured free fatty acids, because if a fat cell is insulin resistant, it will be releasing a great deal of free fatty acids. And so plasma free fatty acids should be up significantly. I just don't know if that happens or not. So I would say this, Doug, there's a lot of speculation that goes on in this kind of conversation. And even my thoughts are speculation, because we just don't know. The idea of, I always get a little wary when people speak with too much certainty about these kinds of things, because I don't know of any evidence that confirms that someone adhering to a low-carb diet has, one, any degree of insulin resistance anywhere, and two, the degree to which there's any demonstrable insulin resistance at the fat cells. And it defies reason to me. I do not believe that happens. So I'm speculating, but so is everyone else.
Yeah, no, that's, I think that's the thing, is that we're busy about to launch this organization called the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. And Adele Height's got a lot to do with that. And she's very strong, very adamant about the fact that we need to be, we can't be dogmatic about an opinion or something, because there's so much that we don't know. And it's so difficult to do really good control trials to show anything in the space, really, especially these days without, because the other option is going to kill someone a lot of the time. So,
yeah.
Do you really ethically want to go down that road? So I think it's really important that we keep an open mind and make sure that what we say is really based on real science and not our own opinions.
Yeah. So I think that a little humility always goes a long way when it comes to these kinds of things, especially among scientists. I think, or anyone who's sort of claiming to be a scientist, and that doesn't mean you have to have a PhD, mind you, but a scientist is a seeker of truth. And so anyone who is acting like a scientist, whether the credentials say they should be or not, I don't give any credence to credentials. As far as I'm concerned, a scientist does not have to have some lofty degree. A scientist should be very humble in how he or she approaches trying to find answers to questions, and very well recognize when something is completely theoretical.
Yeah. You're kind of known as the insulin resistance guru, basically, and but tell me something, just for those folks who don't know, and I'm sure most of them probably do, but for those who don't, how did your journey start? How did you even become interested in this and become like an authority on it in the end,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word?
Yeah. For lack of a better word, because there may be better words that aren't quite as bold as authority, if I'm being modest about it. It started because of an interest in obesity in general. And I was interested as a young master's student. I was starting to wonder, what is it about someone having too much fat that is making them sick? And I, as a master's student, found a paper that had been published a few years prior in the late 90s that detailed how fat cells, when they expand, they start to release pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that was so interesting to me because it was interesting for two reasons. One, it revealed that fat cells were endocrine organs, which is something I had never considered. Now, we'd already known before then that fat cells release hormones like leptin, but I didn't know that at the time. So this was very revelatory to me, that fat cells are secreting molecules that are influencing the body, like hormones. And then second, that these inflammatory proteins, these cytokines, could then be promoting some illness throughout the rest of the body, creating what was called, and I think it probably still is, a subclinical inflammation. So the person isn't obviously suffering from this inflammation. It's subclinical, but it's detectable, it's quantifiable nonetheless. That planted the seed of interest in how obesity connects to disease, and at the time, and to this day still for me, especially how it connects to type 2 diabetes. People were starting to throw around the term in the early 2000s of diabesity, this just the confluence of these two disorders, which almost always run together. And this inflammation, this obesity-induced inflammation, really appeared to be quite a strong connection. So, and it also instilled a love of the fat cell in my mind, and as a scientist. And to this day, I still am very interested in fat cells. This is tissue that we're studying from humans and from rodents, and we're growing fat cells in culture dishes. And it is relevant because I believe insulin resistance. Not only is insulin resistance the foundation of explaining how obesity connects to type 2 diabetes, and that made it relevant to my interest in obesity-induced diseases, but back to the fat cell, insulin resistance starts at the fat cell, I believe. Now, there's some speculation there. There are multiple tissues that become insulin resistant. That we know that for certain. It's impossible, to my knowledge, to know which tissue becomes insulin resistant first. My opinion is that it starts in the fat cell because we can follow a logical sequence of events that would explain how the insulin-resistant fat cell is spreading that insulin resistance to the rest of the body. It's not as easy to identify it if, for example, it starts at the muscle. Well, I mean, you can. I mean, I can imagine theories to explain it starting at any tissue. I believe it starts at the fat cell because if you give someone a hormone that directly improves insulin sensitivity only at the fat cell, you correct the insulin sensitivity. The glucose gets improved, and as glucose gets improved as well, blood glucose, that's not a fat cell issue because fat cell consumes very little glucose. If you're improving the patient's glucose, that means you've improved their insulin sensitivity at their muscle and their liver as well. And so that's why my paradigm is the way it is, that it's the fat cell that falls first, and then it's the domino that bumps into tissues like the muscle and the liver. And when they become insulin resistant, now you have a person who can't control their glucose anymore because the muscle can't pull it in very well, and the muscle is the vast major consumer of glucose. And as the liver becomes insulin resistant, it is breaking down glycogen all the time and making glucose all the time, and so adding to the glucose burden in the blood, further increasing the insulin. Now, interestingly, when we are growing fat cells in the lab, I know there's great debate and discussion on what are the true origins of insulin resistance. And once again, I think an ounce of humility goes a long way when people speak about these things. And there's so much speculation. My thought is there are multiple inputs that would make the fat cell become insulin resistant. Hyperinsulinemia will cause fat cell insulin resistance. inflammatory markers, inflammatory proteins like TNF alpha or interleukin 1 beta. Those will cause insulin resistance at a fat cell or any tissue, actually. Cortisol or cortisol-like molecules, so stress hormones, will cause insulin resistance. And so those are three signals that will directly cause like immediate insulin resistance. In fact, I can have cell cultures of adipocytes. I can increase the insulin. I've done this in animals as well, and detect insulin resistance over time. I can put on the cortisol-like molecules and detect insulin resistance. I can put on the inflammatory cytokines and detect insulin resistance. So those are absolute, acute, direct antagonist signals with regards to insulin sensitivity. So molecules that are directly causing insulin resistance. Now, what I haven't mentioned, but I think it's still relevant, is the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat linoleic acid. I absolutely believe that contributes to insulin resistance, but it is not as direct an effect. For example, I can put linoleic acid on these fat cells and they will not become insulin resistant like the other ones will. But it does start to affect the growth of the fat cell, not allowing a fat cell to grow through hyperplasia and rather forcing it to grow through hypertrophy. And we know that that is pathogenic. We know that that contributes to insulin resistance. So as much as I truly am an advocate of the idea that linoleic acid contributes to insulin resistance, and I truly am, I can also state with absolute conviction, when I put linoleic acid onto fat cells or muscle cells, they do not become insulin resistant. It is not the immediate effect like the other inputs are, but I still strongly believe it is relevant insofar as it will affect the growth of the adipocytes, forcing adipocytes to grow through hypertrophy rather than hyperplasia, which means the adipocyte will become insulin resistant.
Do you want to maybe just explain quickly for those who don't know what the difference between hyperplasia and hypertrophy?
Yeah, thanks. Right. Yeah, so as someone's gaining fat, which only will happen if insulin is elevated. If insulin is elevated, the body is in a mode, the body will be more inclined to store fat. It shifts to sugar burning and it reduces fat burning and promotes fat storage. As you are promoting fat storage through a sufficient calorie intake and through elevated insulin, fat mass can grow through two ways. Most people, when they've finished puberty and have gone into adulthood, late teens in girls, early 20s in boys, their number of fat cells is set. And so if they have sufficient caloric intake and elevated insulin, their fat cell number won't change. Each individual fat cell will grow. And so that is hypertrophy. In contrast, some people have this potential, and some drugs will foster this potential, that as a fat cell starts to grow, before it ever gets too big, it recruits a new fat cell and it will start to carry some of that fat, and then another new fat cell and another. That is hyperplastic fat growth or hyperplasia. Hypertrophic fat cell is basically that there's no vacancy. There's no room for any more storage. Hyperplastic fat growth is there's always more room. We can always carry more energy. If you think of it from the perspective of the hypertrophic fat cell, it is reaching, in fact, a dangerous dimension. It has gotten 4 or 5 times bigger than the average fat cell, and it simply is not feasible for it to grow more. However, if insulin is still elevated, it's attempting to force feed the already obese fat cell, and so the hypertrophic fat cell will become insulin resistant. And while it does still take in insulin, it does not turn down its insulin intake, although it does turn down its glucose intake. Fat can still come in, but now it's leaking fat out at, we'll say roughly the same rate as the fat it's taking in. So it doesn't start to shrink. It stays big, but at least it doesn't get any bigger. And the elevated insulin should be inhibiting the lipolysis. You'd mentioned HSL, and I would add ATGL, these enzymes that are very much under the control of insulin. They stop listening to insulin. Now they're breaking down the triglycerides and releasing a lot of free fatty acids. They shouldn't be. They're insulin resistant though, so they don't listen anymore to the insulin. And now one other thing. So one thing, that fat cell has become insulin resistant to survive, because if it gets any bigger, it's simply a dimension that is not sustainable. And then second, that hypertrophic fat cell is releasing pro-inflammatory cytokines in part because it is hypoxic. It is so big now that it is, and its neighboring fat cells are so big that some of the fat cells have become too far. They're too far from capillaries. And a cell must be in close proximity to a capillary to blood flow in order to survive. It's got to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. It needs to exchange metabolites, get in energy and release other, metabolites like free fatty acids. And so by increasing the pro-inflammatory cytokines, part of what it's trying to do is increase new capillary development. One of the cytokines it will be releasing is one called vascular endothelial growth factor, which is the fat cell's attempt to increase to stimulate the creation of new capillaries. And so the becoming insulin resistant and releasing pro-inflammatory cytokines are two ways in which the fat cell is trying to survive. Now, of course, Doug, you realize, and anyone listening, I'm speculating a little bit, right? Like I'm imagining, what's the fat cell thinking? Why is it acting the way it is? And those are fun questions, and it happens a lot in our field. I would just want someone to know that we know how these things happen. We know how the fat cell becomes hypertrophic, and we know the mechanisms behind it. We don't know why. I joke with my students that that's a divine question. God only knows why the fat cell is, who knows why the body evolved the way it did. We can only speculate. That's pure philosophy. So my philosophy on this is the fat cell is attempting to survive. Becoming insulin resistant prevents it from becoming too big, even bigger than it is. By releasing pro-inflammatory cytokines, it's attempting to increase vascularization in the adipose to survive. But the consequence of this is now felt downstream. Now you have the pancreas becoming insulin resistant, the liver, the muscle, the brain, all the blood vessels, and those are the dominoes that I mentioned earlier that fall after the fat cell has bumped into them.
But now, so the fat cells become insulin resistant and it's leaking fatty acids in that. Once they get back in the bloodstream, are they reformulated into triglycerides? Is that resulting in much higher triglyceride levels? What is the net result of that? And if you look at your blood markers and stuff.
That is a great question, Doug. I don't know. I don't know the degree to, it's possible that those free fatty acids, in fact, go back into fat cells and re-esterify. But the degree to which those would be taken up by the liver and esterified there into triglycerides onto VLDL, I don't know. It's possible that it would contribute to that. It's very possible.
Yeah.
In fact, Dave Feldman would know that, I'm sure.
It would be interesting to ask him that. Yeah, for sure. So now let's go to the muscle cells. What is insulin resistance in the muscle cells? I mean, as far as I understand it, basically, its job there is to get glucose into the muscles and to help. I don't know how much is involved, but basically, excess glucose is getting stored as glycogen. So what happens when the muscle cells become insulin resistant? What do you
Yeah. So the most obvious effect is that glucose uptake is compromised. So muscle is one of the very few tissues that has a glucose transporter that is dependent on insulin, mostly dependent on insulin. So in other words, for the muscle to take in glucose, it needs insulin to be working well. And and again, muscle, I might not have mentioned this number, but postprandial, like after someone has eaten, the muscle is responsible for 80% of glucose uptake. So almost all of the glucose that is leaving the blood, helping blood glucose levels come back down, it's happening because it's going into the muscle. And so if the muscle is compromised in its glucose uptake because it's insulin resistant, you can see now this is a person who's going to have a very hard time controlling glucose. They simply don't have that glucose sink available anymore. So as the muscle becomes insulin resistant, the loss of glucose uptake is a very significant effect. And then other than that, the loss of insulin sensitivity could result in enhanced proteolysis. So the muscle may be breaking down protein into amino acids at a more rapid rate than it should. Insulin defends muscle protein. It inhibits protein breakdown. Insulin abhors breaking things down. Insulin only wants to build things up. Muscle protein's no exception, or at least defending the muscle protein. The degree to which insulin actually stimulates muscle protein synthesis is unclear and debated. But it's likely that it doesn't really provide too much. You don't really need an insulin bump to promote muscle growth. But I think it's safe to say you do need insulin to prevent muscle breakdown. And so you can have this phenomenon of sarcopenic obesity. So someone who's overweight and insulin resistant and their muscles are starting to waste away, you know, which is a pretty vicious situation to be in. You're getting heavier and you have less capable muscles to move yourself around. So those would be the two main phenomena, the two main effects: the loss of glucose uptake and the loss of defending muscle protein as the muscle cell becomes insulin resistant.
And in terms of the lack of muscle of glucose uptake, does that result in lower glycogen stores and
Yes.
Lower energy levels and those kinds of things? Because you're not taking up that glucose to provide the energy that the muscles are waiting for, right?
Yeah. There would definitely be a potential for reduced glycogen storage. Now, overall energy, I don't want to say that, simply because muscle is a very greedy tissue. And if it's not, meeting its energetic needs through glucose alone, it can be using free fatty acids very happily.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the muscle is going to be starving.
So one of the other things, and I know Rob Sivers talks about this, like he feels like the major purpose of insulin originally was more to control glucagon as opposed to glucose, and that when becoming insulin resistant means that it's not having its desired effect and damping down glucagon, which means that you're continuing to make and create glucose, which leads to hyperglycemia. So what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is some validity to that perspective. Although again, insulin does I think to say that insulin, not that he necessarily said this, I don't think it's accurate to say insulin's main role is simply to control glucagon. No, that we can't say that, because insulin does countless things throughout the body. And every cell has insulin receptors, including cells that don't have anything to do with glucagon, that neither make glucagon nor have glucagon receptors, because not all cells do. All cells do have insulin receptors. But however, what I appreciate in that perspective is that the loss of when the glucagon producing alpha cells become insulin resistant, then you are right into the throes of diabetes. So that is the loss of insulin inhibiting glucagon is relevant not only for insulin resistance like type 2 diabetes, which is typically a hyperglucagonemic state. Glucagon will be elevated. And to your point, when glucagon is high, glucagon is constantly going to be pushing the liver to make more and more glucose. But also in type 1 diabetes, there's something quite profound about the relationship between the beta cell and the alpha cell in the pancreas. So in a type 1 diabetic, the beta cells are no longer making insulin. Insulin will tell the alpha cell to stop making glucagon. And so in the case of type 1 diabetes, no insulin from the beta cell means the alpha cell is just producing glucagon like gangbusters. It's just going full steam ahead because there's no molecule to tell it to turn off. Now you would say, well, but the type 1 diabetic is treating with insulin. And so the insulin injections will act to inhibit glucagon release at the alpha cell. But it doesn't, because the actual amount of insulin that the alpha cells need is significantly higher than any amount of systemic insulin. So for example, when we measure insulin in a patient, we're getting the insulin that is relative to all of the blood in the entire body. But when you zoom into the level, and the same would go for a type 1 diabetic who's injecting with insulin. They inject their 10 or 20 units of insulin, and that is flowing through the entire body at very low levels. However, if we zoom into the level of the pancreas, where we literally have beta cells right next to alpha cells, the alpha cells need a significant signal from insulin to turn off glucagon production. And so they're used to seeing orders of magnitude more insulin, because as the beta cell is making the insulin, it's surrounding the glucagon producing alpha cells, and then it goes into the bloodstream, getting heavily, heavily diluted. And so the amount of insulin that, say, a muscle cell needs to pull in glucose is significantly less than the amount of insulin that an alpha cell needs in order to stop producing glucagon. And if a type 1 diabetic were to attempt to inject the necessary amount of insulin to turn off glucagon production, they would die from hypoglycemia, because the muscles would consume all the glucose, and there'd be no glucose, no ketones, and the brain would starve and they would die. So that's a problem. Type 1 diabetes is just as much a disease of a lack of insulin as it is a disease of too much glucagon, because you simply cannot put in enough insulin to turn the glucagon off. But that's why Dr. Roger Unger, who really identified this, he found that there were other therapies like somatostatin or even leptin, which do act to turn off glucagon production, and you could actually solve the diabetes without insulin at all. And those are, of course, strictly in laboratory settings, but his perspective is what I just said a moment ago, that perhaps type 1 diabetes is a glucagon excess disease rather than an insulin deficient disease.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and so I just so appreciate your commitment to keeping an open mind with all of these discussions. It's I think it's, especially as keto is becoming more and more the buzzword and everything, there's just so many people with dogmatic opinions out there that I think do us all a disservice in the end, because
yeah, on both sides, right,
yes.
Doug? I mean, we have the dogma, which is of course counter to anything low carb, and then we have kind of growing aspects of dogma within our community.
Correct.
And I think that I keep coming back to this word. We just have to have some humility to realize that we might not know what we think we know. And I say that as much to myself as to anyone else. I am always very reluctant, and I hope I'm very forthcoming in admitting when I don't know something and that I'm speculating. I think I'm comfortable saying that, maybe in part because I don't define myself by what I know with regards to insulin resistance. You know, my sense of self-worth and value comes from what I do in the home with my wife and children, and everything
Right.
else is just sort of surrogate and extra. It's just fluff. Not that it's not important, but I don't mind. Yeah, I shouldn't be making myself the focus here. I think within our community, we should be studiously avoiding dogmatic thinking and constantly be checking what we think we know, lest we become that which we grew to despise as we look at those who are very antagonistic towards low-carb diets.
Yeah. You are in our lineup for this Boca event that was supposed to be in Boca, that's now a virtual event in January. So I'm looking forward to hearing your talk there. We also normally have a final panel at the end of the weekend on Sunday, and I hopefully will be able to get you on that as well, because Rob Cyrus is also one of the speakers, and I would love to hear you two guys maybe dig a bit deep.
Reason together. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I think I think every time I hear either of you speak, I learn a whole lot. And I think if the two of you were actually having a discussion about some of this stuff, it would be, I think some fascinating insights would come out of it.
It would be my pleasure. Yeah, that would be delightful. Yep.
Yeah, I really look forward to that. So again, thank you for doing this. With the whole SMHP launch that's happening in the next week or so, this will probably air in a few weeks from now, but definitely before the end of the year. And obviously, hopefully that'll help promote people to come and attend the event, because I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really sorry that it's going to be virtual, because I've never had the opportunity to meet you in person up till now in all these years. So I look forward to the time. Yeah, I look forward to the time when we can do one in person and I can get to shake your hand.
Yep. That sounds great. Yeah, Doug, thanks for reaching out, and thanks for the time. This was a fun discussion. Thanks for letting me rant a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm here for.
Great.
Righty, bud. Thanks.
Thanks, brother.
You've been listening to an episode of the Low Carb USA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lowcarbusa.